The loneliness was a physical thing, a weighted blanket I hadn't asked for, draped over my shoulders day and night. It had been my constant companion for so long that its absence, I imagined, would feel like floating, like a terrifying loss of gravity. My life was a series of quiet, predictable loops. Wake, work, eat, sleep. The view from my apartment window was the most varied part of my day, and even that was mostly just the weathered brick of the building opposite mine and a sliver of the shared courtyard below. And of course him, Cole, my neighbor in 3B. He was a study in controlled force, a man who seemed to take up more space than his physical frame warranted. I'd learned his schedule through the osmosis of proximity. The low rumble of his truck starting at 6:30 in the morning, the heavy tread of his work boots on the landing in the evening, the faint, clean scent of sawdust, and something uniquely his, sandalwood, maybe, that sometimes drifted into the hallway. He was a carpenter, a creator of solid, beautiful things from raw material. I was a writer, a creator of worlds from thin air. We were separated by a thin wall and a universe of difference. For 2 years, my interactions with him had been limited to nods in the hallway and the occasional, stilted hey at the mailboxes. Each one felt like a monumental event I would replay in my head for hours. The way his mouth tilted up at one corner. The brief, intense focus of his dark eyes before he moved on. I had constructed an entire fantasy life around these fleeting scraps of attention, a pathetic and secret architecture of longing. He had a girlfriend, a willowy blonde named Jessica who laughed too loudly and hung on his arm like a charm bracelet. He was straight. He was unobtainable. He was a safe object for my unrequited affections, a star I could watch from a distance without any danger of getting burned. My world was small, and I had curated it that way. It was safe. It was manageable. It was crushingly, profoundly lonely. I had accepted this as my state of being, the price of admission for a life lived without the risk of rejection. I observed, I imagined, I wrote. I did not participate. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of other people's stories. And then came the knock. It was after midnight. A Tuesday, I think, or maybe a Wednesday. The days blurred together. Rain was lashing against my window pane, a furious, percussive rhythm that matched the anxiety thrumming under my skin. I was trying to work, but the words wouldn't come. The blinking cursor on the screen was a tiny, mocking heartbeat. I was lost in that familiar state of sleepless melancholy when the sound ripped through the quiet of my apartment. Not a tentative tap, but 3 solid, urgent raps on the wood. My heart leaped into my throat. No one ever knocked on my door, especially not at this hour. My first thought was that something was wrong. A fire, a gas leak, some building-wide emergency. I scrambled from my chair, my socked feet slipping on the hardwood floor. I peered through the peephole, my breath held tight in my chest. And then I saw him. Cole. His broad shoulders filled the distorted lens. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain, and water dripped from the sharp line of his jaw. He wasn't looking at the door, but down at his hands, which were clenched into fists at his sides. Even through the fisheye view, I could see a tension in him that was new, a brittleness in his usually solid posture. I fumbled with the locks, my fingers suddenly clumsy and slick. The deadbolt slid back with a loud, definitive clunk. I opened the door just a crack, the security chain still in place. Cole. My voice was a croak. He looked up, and his eyes found mine. They were dark, stormy, and stripped of their usual calm. He looked wrecked. Leo, he said, his voice a low gravel that was rougher than usual. Sorry to can I come in? It was the first time he'd ever said my name. I'd heard him say it once before, to Jessica in the hallway, a dismissive, that's Leo, from 3A, but hearing it from his lips, directed at me, was a shock to the system. I was Leo. I was real to him. My brain short-circuited. I slid the chain free and pulled the door open wider. Yeah, of course. Come in. He stepped inside, bringing the storm with him. The scent of rain, wet asphalt, and that warm sandalwood scent filled my small entryway. He was dripping onto my floor, but I couldn't bring myself to care. He stood there for a moment, looking lost, his gaze sweeping over my small, neat living room, the stacks of books, the worn armchair, the glow of my laptop screen. He seemed like a caged animal, too large and powerful for the space. Is everything okay? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He ran a hand through his wet hair. shaking his head slowly. Not really. Me and Jess, we had a fight. A bad one. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The exhaustion rolling off him was a story in itself. I couldn't be there. And I didn't want to go to a bar. I saw your light on. I saw your light on. The words echoed in the quiet space between us. He had been outside, in the rain, and had looked up at my window, at my small beacon in the dark, and chosen it. Chosen me. My mind reeled with the implications, even as the sensible part of me insisted it meant nothing. It was just proximity, a port in a storm. You want some coffee? Or tea? I offered, falling back on the mundane rituals of hospitality. No, thanks. He finally moved, walking past me into the living room. He stopped in the middle of the rug, turning in a slow circle, as if trying to get his bearings. He looked at my single bed, tucked into an alcove. It was unmade, the covers a rumpled mess. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of embarrassment at the intimacy of it. This stranger, this object of my deepest affections, seeing the place where I slept, where I dreamed. He didn't seem to notice. His shoulders slumped, the fight finally going out of him. He walked over to the bed and sat on the very edge, his back to me. The mattress dipped under his weight. He was a solid, undeniable presence in my most private space. He stared at the wall for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between us. Then, without turning around, he spoke, the words so quiet I almost didn't catch them. Move over. My breath hitched. My entire world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a simple, desperate command. Move over. As if it were the most natural thing in the world for him to be here, in my bed. My mind raced, trying to find a foothold. This is nothing. He's upset. He's not thinking. He just needs a place to crash. He thinks of you as a brother, a non-threatening, safe space. All the logical explanations flew through my head, a frantic flock of birds. But they couldn't drown out the thunderous, hopeful, terrifying beat of my own heart. I am here. He is here. This is happening. I moved. I didn't think about it. My body just responded. I shuffled over to the far side of the bed, pressing myself against the cold wall. The space he had occupied on the edge of the mattress suddenly felt vast. He didn't lie down right away. He just sat there, his back a rigid line of tension. I could hear the unsteady rhythm of his breathing over the drumming of the rain. I lay there, stiff as a board, my mind a blank canvas of shock. Finally, he sighed, a long, ragged sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He kicked off his heavy, wet boots, leaving them in a puddle on my floor. Then he lay down on his back, on top of the covers, his arms crossed over his chest. He was fully dressed, his damp jeans and t-shirt clinging to him. The bed, which had always felt more than big enough for just me, suddenly felt impossibly small. His shoulder was inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace of turmoil and exhaustion. We lay there in the dark, two strangers separated by a few inches of air and a universe of unspoken things. The only sounds were the rain and our breathing. His was deep and uneven, mine was shallow and quick. I stared at the ceiling, my eyes wide open, every nerve ending in my body screamingly aware of his presence. This was not real. This could not be happening. Cole, the man from my daydreams, the untouchable neighbor, was lying in my bed. The sheer, terrifying intimacy of it was overwhelming. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any small motion would break the spell and he would realize where he was, who he was with, and leave. After what felt like an eternity, his breathing began to even out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He was exhausted. He had come to me, and he had fallen asleep. The thought was both comforting and agonizing. It meant he felt safe here. It also meant this was nothing more than a moment of desperation for him, a convenient harbor that he would forget by morning. I listened to him sleep, my own exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a hyper-vigilant awareness. I could smell the rain in his hair, the faint scent of his skin. I could feel the slight shift of the mattress with each breath he took. I was closer to him than I had ever dreamed of being, and yet we were still worlds apart. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake, a sentinel in the dark, guarding the strange, fragile peace that had settled in my small apartment. I watched the first pale fingers of dawn creep through the blinds, illuminating the room in shades of gray. Cole was still asleep, his face turned towards me now. In sleep, The tension had left his features. His brow was smooth, his mouth slightly parted. He looked younger, more vulnerable. A lock of dark hair had fallen across his forehead. I had an overwhelming, insane urge to reach out and brush it back. My hand twitched at my side, but I forced it to stay still. I was an observer. That was my role. To touch him would be to cross a line, to shatter the delicate unreality of the moment. When he finally woke, it was with a suddenness that startled me. His eyes snapped open, and for a second, they were filled with disorientation. He blinked, his gaze focusing on the unfamiliar ceiling. Then he turned his head and saw me. I was still lying on my side, watching him. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Confusion, maybe regret. I braced myself for the awkward apology, the hasty retreat. "Morning," he rasped, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I managed to say, my own voice thin. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He scrubbed his hands over his face, sighing. "God, I'm sorry, Leo. I shouldn't have just shown up like that. And crashed in your bed. It's fine," I said, the words coming out too quickly. "Don't worry about it. You needed a place to stay?" He looked at me then, really looked at me. His gaze was intense, searching. "Yeah, I did." He stood up, stretching his arms over his head. The fabric of his t-shirt pulled taut across his chest and back, and I had to force myself to look away, focusing on a crack in the ceiling plaster instead. "I should go? Let you get back to your life? Do you want some coffee first?" The offer was out of my mouth before I could stop it. I was desperate to prolong the moment, to keep him here for just a few minutes longer. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. Then he turned back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It didn't quite reach his eyes, but it was there. "Yeah, coffee sounds good." The relief that washed over me was so profound it left me weak. We stood in my tiny kitchen, a careful foot of space between us, as I prepared the coffee. The silence was thick with unspoken things. I was acutely aware of his every movement, the way he leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, watching my hands as I scooped coffee grounds into the filter. I could feel his gaze on me like a physical touch. I focused on the task at hand, on the familiar ritual, trying to keep my own hands from shaking. "So, you and Jessica," I started, then immediately regretted it. It was none of my business. He sighed. "It's been coming for a while. Last night was just the end." He didn't sound sad, just weary. "She packed her stuff this morning while I was here, so she was gone." The thought sent a treacherous jolt of hope through me, which I immediately tried to smother. Her absence didn't change anything. He was still straight. I was still me. I handed him a mug of coffee. Our fingers brushed as he took it from me. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but it sent a spark up my arm that made my breath catch. His eyes met mine over the rim of the mug, and for a heartbeat, the air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with his ex-girlfriend. He looked away first, clearing his throat. "Thanks for this, Leo," he said, his voice low. "For everything, it was nothing," I said, my own voice betraying none of the chaos inside me. He left a few minutes later, and the apartment felt cavernously empty in his absence. The only evidence he had been there was the damp patch on the floor where his boots had been and the lingering scent of sandalwood and rain. I went to the window and watched him cross the courtyard to his own apartment. He didn't look back. I stood there for a long time, my hand pressed against the cold glass, my world irrevocably altered. He had crossed the threshold. He had been in my space, in my bed. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart had been breached, and I had no idea how to rebuild them. I wasn't even sure I wanted to. The days that followed were a strange, new kind of torture. The dynamic between us had shifted, but into what? I couldn't say. The polite nods in the hallway were replaced by actual conversations. Short, mundane talks about the weather, about a leaky faucet in the building, about his work. He would ask me about my writing, and I would give vague, non-committal answers, embarrassed by my solitary profession. He'd tell me about a cabinet he was building, his hands moving as he described the joinery, his passion for his craft evident in the light in his eyes. I became a more dedicated observer than ever before. I learned the different sounds his tools made through the wall, the high-pitched whine of the sander, the rhythmic tap of a hammer. I spent far too much time at my window, watching him. I watched him unload heavy planks of wood from his truck, the muscles in his back and arms cording with the effort. I watched him sit on his own small balcony in the evenings, a beer in his hand, staring off into the distance with a look of profound contemplation on his face. He was a puzzle I was desperately trying to solve, and every new piece of information only made him more enigmatic. He started finding excuses to be near me. He offered to fix a squeaky hinge on my closet door, a task that took him an hour and involved a lot of close proximity in my small bedroom. He brought me a plate of grilled steak one evening, claiming he'd made too much. We ate sitting on my floor, our backs against the sofa, the conversation easy and comfortable in a way it had never been before. These moments were intoxicating, filling the hollow spaces of my loneliness with a dangerous, addictive hope. I analyzed every interaction, every word, every gesture, searching for meaning. When he fixed the hinge, his arm brushed against mine, and the casual contact felt like a brand. I replayed it in my mind 100 times. Was it accidental? Did he feel it too? When he smiled, did the crinkles around his eyes linger a moment too long? His gaze would sometimes hold mine for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, a silent, searching look that made my stomach swoop. I was driving myself mad with the constant analysis, caught in a feedback loop of hope and doubt. He's just being friendly, the rational part of my brain would insist. He's lonely after his breakup, and you're convenient. But the hopeful, yearning part of me, the part that had been starved for so long, whispered a different story. The touches became more frequent, but they were always plausibly deniable. A hand on my shoulder to get my attention, his knee bumping against mine as we sat on the couch watching a movie I'd never have chosen on my own. He'd invited himself over, claiming his TV was broken. We sat in the dark, the flickering light of the screen illuminating the tense space between us. His scent, that sandalwood and sawdust combination, was a constant, pleasant distraction. During a particularly loud explosion in the action film, he leaned closer to say something, his breath warm against my ear. "This is ridiculous," he'd murmured, and the low vibration of his voice sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't have told you what the movie was about if my life depended on it. My entire universe had shrunk to the space on my couch, to the heat of the man sitting next to me. One Saturday, the sky opened up in a torrential downpour reminiscent of the night he'd first knocked on my door. I was at my desk, trying to work, when I noticed a dark stain spreading on the ceiling in the corner of my living room. A moment later, a drop of water landed on my head. Then another. I grabbed a bucket from under the sink just as the drip became a steady trickle. A groan from above signaled a bigger problem, and suddenly, the trickle became a small, steady stream. My upstairs neighbor was notoriously unreliable, and I knew getting a plumber on a weekend would be impossible. Panic began to set in. On pure instinct, I ran out of my apartment and banged on Cole's door. He opened it a moment later, shirtless, a towel slung around his neck. His chest was dusted with dark hair that tapered down into the waistband of his jeans. I saw a faint, jagged scar on his left pectoral. My mouth went dry. "Leo? What's wrong?" His eyes were sharp with concern. "My ceiling," I managed to stammer out, pointing back towards my apartment. "It's leaking. A lot." He didn't hesitate. He tossed the towel onto a chair and followed me back into my apartment. He took one look at the stream of water pouring into the rapidly filling bucket and swore under his breath. "Okay," he said, taking charge immediately. "We need to move this stuff." He started grabbing the books and electronics near the leak, his movements efficient and sure. I was galvanized into action, following his lead. We worked together, a frantic, silent team, moving my furniture and belongings away from the spreading puddle on the floor. The water was coming faster now. "The main shutoff is in the basement," he said, his voice tight. "I'll go. You keep bailing." He was gone before I could protest. I was left alone with the deluge, swapping out the bucket for a larger trash can, sloshing water into the sink. The situation was a disaster, but a strange sense of exhilaration hummed through me. We were a team. We were handling this together. Cole came back a few minutes later, soaked from his run to the basement and back. The flow of water from the ceiling had slowed to a drip. "Got it," he said, breathing heavily. He leaned against the doorframe, surveying the damage. My living room was in chaos. Furniture was pushed into the center of the room, rugs were rolled up, and a large puddle covered a third of my floor. "Thanks," I said, feeling breathless myself. "I don't know what I would have done. Don't worry about it," he said, pushing off the doorframe. Now we clean up. For the next 2 hours, we worked. Cole was a force of nature. He got towels from his apartment, a shop vac from his truck. We soaked up the water, moved the furniture back, and assessed the damage. We were both drenched, our clothes clinging to us. The work was hard and messy, but we fell into an easy rhythm. We didn't talk much, but the shared effort was a form of communication more intimate than words. At one point, I slipped on a wet patch of floor, and his hand shot out, grabbing my arm to steady me. His grip was strong, his fingers wrapping around my bicep. He held on for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes meeting mine. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and something else, something charged and electric. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I breathed. "Thanks." He let go, but I could still feel the imprint of his hand on my skin. We finished cleaning up in a weary silence. We were both exhausted, soaked, and covered in grime. We stood in the middle of my chaotic but mostly dry apartment, the adrenaline slowly draining away. "I need a shower," he said, running a hand through his wet hair. "You too." "Yeah," I agreed, suddenly very aware of my damp, clinging shirt and the plaster dust on my face. "You can use mine," he offered. "The water pressure's better." "I'll grab us some beers." The offer was so casual, so simple, but it felt monumental. Use his shower. Go into his apartment, his private space. It was a new level of intimacy, a new boundary being crossed. I found myself nodding before I had even fully processed the suggestion. Okay, his apartment was the negative image of mine. Where mine was filled with books and soft textures, his was all clean lines, dark wood, and metal. It was neat, organized, and smelled overwhelmingly of him, of sawdust and sandalwood. He pointed me towards the bathroom. "Towels are in the cabinet. Help yourself." "I'll order a pizza." Standing in his shower, surrounded by his things, his razor on the shelf, his brand of shampoo, felt like a profound act of trespass. The water was hot, and I let it run over me, washing away the grime and the stress of the day. When I stepped out, wrapped in one of his large, fluffy towels that smelled of his laundry detergent, I felt raw and exposed. I got dressed in my damp clothes, not wanting to presume any further on his hospitality. When I came out, he was sitting on his couch, 2 beers and a pizza box on the coffee table. He had showered too, and his hair was still damp. He was wearing a soft gray t-shirt and sweatpants, and he looked relaxed and comfortable in a way I had never seen him. He patted the cushion next to him. "Sit. You earned it." I sat, leaving a careful distance between us. He handed me a beer, and the cold bottle was a shock against my warm skin. We ate the pizza in a comfortable silence, the exhaustion of the day settling over us. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. The question caught me off guard. "Leaving? Leaving what?" "The apartment. This city," he clarified, his gaze distant. "This life. Do you ever feel stuck?" It was the most personal question he had ever asked me. It was a glimpse behind the curtain of his stoic exterior, a moment of unexpected vulnerability. I thought about my small, safe life, my routine, my loneliness. "All the time," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But I don't know where else I'd go. Or who I'd be if I wasn't here." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the beer bottle in his hands. "I know what you mean." He looked up and met my gaze. "I enlisted right out of high school. Saw a lot of the world. But I never really felt like I belonged anywhere. Came back here because it was familiar. Built a life. Got a girlfriend. Did all the things you're supposed to do." He paused, taking a long drink of his beer. "But it never felt right. It felt like I was playing a part. Like I was building a house with no foundation." He was talking about Jessica, but it felt like he was talking about something more, something deeper. He was sharing a piece of his soul with me, a confession of his own quiet desperation. In that moment, he wasn't the confident, capable man I watched from my window. He was just a man, searching for something he couldn't name. And I felt a profound, aching connection to him, a recognition of the same loneliness I carried in my own chest. We sat there in the dim light of his living room, the shared confession hanging in the air between us. The barriers were gone. We were no longer just neighbors. We were 2 lonely men, sharing a pizza and a moment of unguarded honesty. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I was in deeper than I had ever imagined. This wasn't a crush anymore. It was something real, something fragile, and something that had the power to completely destroy me. The aftermath of the flood created a new normal. My landlord was slow to fix the ceiling, so a giant, ugly patch of exposed plaster and 2x4s became a semi-permanent feature of my living room. Cole checked on it daily, his professional eye assessing the slow-drying process. These check-ins were just an excuse, a new ritual that allowed him into my space every evening. Sometimes he'd stay for 5 minutes, his large frame filling my doorway as he gave me a progress report. Other times, he'd linger, leaning against the kitchen counter while I made dinner, the conversation flowing easily between us. The tension, however, did not dissipate. It coiled tighter with each shared glance, each casual touch. It was a living thing between us, a third presence in the room. I felt like I was walking on a high wire, balanced precariously between friendship and something more. A single misstep, a single misinterpreted signal, could send me plummeting. My internal monologue was a constant, exhausting hum of analysis. He brought me coffee this morning. Does that mean anything? He smiled when I told that stupid joke. Was he just being polite? He stood very close to me just now. Could he hear my heart pounding? The tipping point came on a Thursday night, about 2 weeks after the flood. Jessica showed up. I heard her before I saw her, her high, sharp voice cutting through the evening quiet of the hallway. I cracked my door open a sliver and peeked out. She was standing in front of Cole's door, her arms crossed, her face a mask of fury. Cole stood in the doorway, blocking her entrance, his expression unreadable and stoic. "I can't believe you, Cole," she was saying, her voice dripping with venom. "You throw away 5 years for what? To be alone? To hide out in this dump?" "It's over, Jess," Cole said, his voice dangerously low and calm. "There's nothing left to say, isn't there?" she shot back, her eyes scanning the hallway. They landed on my slightly ajar door, and a cruel, knowing smirk spread across her face. "Or have you just found a new hobby? Spending a lot of time with your weird little neighbor, aren't you? What is he? Your pet project? Your charity case?" My blood ran cold. I felt pinned by her gaze, exposed. I wanted to slam the door, to disappear, but I was frozen. Cole's body went rigid. He took a half step forward, shielding his doorway, shielding me from her view. "Leave him out of this," he growled, a protective menace in his voice I had never heard before. "This is about you and me. Now go home," she scoffed, tossing her blonde hair. "Fine. Have fun in your little boys' club." She turned on her heel and stormed down the hallway, her heels clicking angrily on the linoleum. Cole stood in his doorway for a long moment, his back to me. Then, he slowly turned, and his eyes met mine through the crack in my door. The look on his face was one of profound weariness, but there was something else there too, something raw and vulnerable. Without a word, he crossed the hallway and pushed my door open, stepping inside and closing it quietly behind him. He didn't say anything. He just walked to my window and stood there, staring out at the darkening courtyard. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders slumped. The silence in the room was deafening, filled with the ugly echoes of Jessica's words. I felt a desperate need to say something, to apologize for eavesdropping, to deny her accusations, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and rough. "You're always looking at me." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, soft and contemplative. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The confrontation. The moment I had been dreading and, on some level, craving. "From this window," he continued, still not looking at me. "I see you sometimes. When I'm working on the truck. Or just sitting out there." He finally turned to face me, his expression earnest and searching. The air between us was thick, charged with years of my unspoken observation and weeks of his undeniable presence. "What do you see, Leo?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct and utterly devastating. What did I see? I saw a man who was strong and capable, who could build things with his hands and calm a crisis with his steady presence. I saw a man who was lonely and searching, who felt like he was playing a part in his own life. I saw the kindness in his eyes when he talked about his work, the weariness in his shoulders after a long day. I saw the man I had spent 2 years secretly, hopelessly falling in love with. My throat was tight, my hands shaking. All my defenses, all the carefully constructed walls, were crumbling. There was nowhere left to hide. He had seen me, truly seen me, and now he was asking for the truth. I took a shaky breath. I see someone. I started, my voice cracking. I see someone I shouldn't want. The confession was out, a raw and painful admission torn from the deepest part of me. I braced myself for the reaction. Disgust, pity, awkward rejection. I expected him to take a step back, to put distance between us, to tell me I had misunderstood everything. He didn't. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the small gap between us. His eyes never left mine. They were dark and intense, and in their depths, I saw not revulsion, but a reflection of my own yearning. He was so close now I could feel the warmth of his body, could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the tiny flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "What if," he said, his voice a low murmur that vibrated through my chest. "What if you're not the only one who's been wanting something they shouldn't?" My mind went completely blank. The world narrowed to his face, to the scent of him, to the impossible words he had just spoken. He was admitting it. He was confirming the insane, hopeful narrative I had been too afraid to believe. "Jess and I," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "We weren't just over that night. We'd been over for months. I just didn't know how to end it. That night, I wasn't just running from her. I was running to something. I saw your light on, and it was like a landmark. A safe place." He lifted a hand, and his calloused fingers gently brushed against my cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to my core. "I've been thinking about this. About you. A lot. I kept telling myself I was just lonely. That you were just a good guy, a friend. But it's more than that. It's been more than that for a while," he was confessing. He was laying himself bare, just as I had. The vulnerability in his eyes was a mirror of my own. All the overthinking, all the analysis, all the doubt, it all melted away, replaced by a stunning, terrifying clarity. This was real. "Cole." I breathed, my voice filled with a wonder that felt like pain. "It's okay to want it, Leo," he whispered, his thumb stroking my jawline. "I do." And then he leaned in. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was slow, deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I met him halfway, my eyes fluttering shut as his lips met mine. The first touch was soft, hesitant, a question. And then, as I leaned into him, it deepened. It was not like any kiss I had ever imagined. It was better. It was real. It tasted of coffee and honesty, and a longing so profound it stole the air from my lungs. His lips were firm and warm, and the faint roughness of his stubble was an intoxicating friction against my skin. His hand moved from my cheek to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me to him. My own hands, seeming to have a will of their own, came up to rest on his solid chest, feeling the steady, rapid beat of his heart beneath my palms. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and silent observation, of unspoken tension and a shared, dawning recognition. It was quiet and sure, and it felt, more than anything else in my entire life, like coming home. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and unsteady. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened, for the monumental shift that had just occurred. The silence was filled with the truth, a truth that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by the solid, grounding presence of the man standing in front of me, his heart beating in time with my own. I woke with a start, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The room was bathed in the hazy gray light of early morning. For a disoriented second, I didn't know what had woken me. Then, the silence registered. The profound, absolute silence of being alone. I turned my head on the pillow. The other side of the bed was empty, the sheets cool to the touch. He was gone. A cold, heavy dread pooled in my stomach, chilling me more than the morning air. Panic, sharp and acidic, rose in my throat. Had I dreamed it all? The confession? The kiss? The way he'd held me afterwards, as we'd simply stood in the middle of my living room, wrapped in a silent embrace that felt more real than anything I'd ever known? We hadn't spoken much. We'd eventually, awkwardly, migrated to the bed. We hadn't done anything more than kiss, but we had fallen asleep facing each other, his hand loosely holding mine. It had been the most peaceful night of sleep I'd had in my adult life. And now he was gone. He'd left without a sound, without a note, without a word. The ugly, familiar voice of self-doubt began to whisper in my ear. He regrets it. It was a mistake. A moment of post-breakup confusion and loneliness. He woke up this morning in the cold light of day and realized what he'd done, who he'd done it with, and he ran. The narrative was so easy to believe, so much more plausible than the alternative. I curled into a ball, pulling the blankets up to my chin, the scent of him, sandalwood and his own unique, warm scent, still clinging to the pillows, a ghostly, mocking reminder. I lay there for what felt like hours, paralyzed by the fear of what came next. The inevitable, excruciatingly awkward encounter in the hallway. The polite, distant nod that would signal the end of everything. The retreat back into our separate corners, the memory of that kiss becoming a wall between us instead of a bridge. The thought was unbearable. I couldn't face it. I decided to stay in my apartment all day, to hide. I would become a ghost again, an observer behind a window. Only this time the observation would be laced with the sharp, bitter poison of what I had briefly held and already lost. My stomach growled, a prosaic reminder of bodily needs in the midst of my emotional tailspin. I needed coffee. I needed the jolt of caffeine to face the long, empty day ahead. I forced myself out of bed, pulling on a sweatshirt, feeling fragile and exposed. I avoided the window, not wanting to see his truck in the parking lot, a solid, tangible proof that he was nearby, but choosing not to be with me. I was standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the coffee maker, trying to summon the will to perform the simple task, when a quiet knock sounded at the door. Not the urgent rapping from that first night, but a soft, hesitant tapping. My heart seized in my chest. It was him. I knew it was him, and I didn't know whether to feel terror or relief. I walked to the door as if wading through deep water. I took a deep, shaky breath and pulled it open. Cole stood there, his hands full. He was holding 2 large mugs of coffee, steam curling gently from their rims. He wasn't smiling. His expression was serious, his eyes searching my face, taking in my rumpled clothes and the fear I was sure was written all over my features. He looked tired, but his gaze was steady. "I figured you'd be out of coffee," he said, his voice low and even. "I used the last of it the other day." I just stared at him, unable to form words. He had gone to his apartment, made coffee, and brought it back. It was such a simple, domestic act, but it felt like a lifeline. "Can I come in?" he asked gently. I nodded, stepping back to let him pass. He walked into my kitchen and set the mugs down on the counter. He turned to face me, leaning back against the counter, creating a deliberate, yet not unwelcoming, space between us. "I'm sorry I left this morning," he began, his eyes fixed on mine. "I woke up early, and my head was loud. I needed to think. I didn't want to wake you. I thought you regretted it." I blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush of insecurity. "I thought you woke up and changed your mind." A flicker of something that looked like pain crossed his face. He shook his head. "No, Leo, no. Not for a second." He pushed off the counter and took a step closer to me, closing the distance until he was standing just in front of me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat of him, see the earnest sincerity in his eyes. "Waking up this morning," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Lying there, next to you. I woke up feeling quiet. For the first time in I don't know how long. The noise in my head was gone. It was just quiet. Safe." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I haven't felt safe like that in years. The raw honesty of his confession hit me like a physical blow. Safe. He had felt safe with me. The word was a balm on the raw, panicked wound in my chest. Relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. "I don't know what this is exactly," he continued, his gaze intense. "I'm not going to pretend I have it all figured out. My whole life, I've just been doing what I thought I was supposed to do. Building the life everyone expected me to build. But it was hollow. Being with you, talking with you, last night, it's the first thing that's felt solid. Real." He finally reached out, not with the passion of the night before, but with a quiet reverence. He took my hand, his large, warm palm engulfing mine. His calloused fingers laced through mine, a simple, definitive gesture of connection. "I don't regret it," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "I'm scared. I'm confused as hell. But I don't regret it. Do you?" I looked down at our joined hands, at the way his hands seemed to fit so perfectly with mine. I looked back up into his searching eyes. "No," I said, my own voice steady for the first time that morning. I'm not confused at all. And I don't regret it. A slow smile spread across his face. And this time, it reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and filling them with a warm, brilliant light. It was like watching the sun rise. He squeezed my hand. Good. Now drink your coffee before it gets cold. The test came sooner than I expected. A few days later, we were leaving the building together to grab some groceries. It was a simple, mundane outing, but for me, it felt like a monumental step. Walking side by side with him in the broad light of day, not as neighbors, but as something else. Something new and undefined. As we stepped out the main door, we nearly collided with Mrs. Gable from 4C, the building's resident queen of gossip. Her eyes, sharp and bird-like, flickered between me and Cole. She took in our proximity, the easy way Cole had his hand on the small of my back as he held the door for me. A thinly veiled, knowing smirk played on her lips. Well, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Looks like you two are becoming quite the pair. Now that that loud girlfriend of yours is out of the picture, Cole. Found a quieter roommate, have you? The insinuation was clear, her tone dripping with condescending curiosity. I froze, my face flushing with heat. I felt the old shame, the old instinct to retreat, to make myself small and invisible. I opened my mouth to stammer out some kind of denial, to create distance, but before I could speak, Cole's hand tightened ever so slightly on my back. It was a small, grounding pressure, a silent message. I've got this. He gave Mrs. Gable a cool, level smile that didn't reach his eyes. Leo's a good neighbor, he said, his voice calm and even, betraying no reaction to her barb. We're just heading to the store. You have a good day. Now he steered me past her, his hand never leaving my back. He didn't rush. His pace was deliberate, unhurried, a quiet display of defiance. We walked all the way to his truck before he spoke again. He opened the passenger door for me, a gesture he'd never made before. As I slid into the seat, he leaned on the doorframe, his expression serious. You okay? He asked. I nodded, still a little shaken. Yeah, I hate that. The way people look. The way they talk. He sighed, his gaze softening. Me too. But we can't control that. He reached in, his hand brushing my knee, a brief, reassuring touch. All we can control is this, he gestured between the two of us. And I'm not going to hide this, Leo. I'm not going to let some busybody old woman make me feel ashamed of this. He closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. As he started the truck, I watched his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the determined set of his mouth. He wasn't just my quiet, stoic neighbor anymore. He was a man who had faced down his own confusion and fear and had chosen me. He had chosen us. And in that moment, sitting in the worn passenger seat of his rumbling truck, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The outside world, with its judgments and its gossip, seemed to fade away, its power diminished. All that mattered was the man next to me and the quiet, solid thing we were starting to build together. A week later, the gaping hole in my ceiling was finally repaired. The workmen left, and my apartment was blessedly quiet and whole again. Cole came over that evening, ostensibly to inspect their work. He ran his hand over the smooth new plaster, nodding in professional approval. Looks good, he said. Solid work, it's weird, I said, looking at the seamless white ceiling. I got used to the hole. It felt like a landmark, the start of something. He turned from the wall and looked at me, a soft smile on his face. He walked over to me, stopping so close I had to tilt my head back to look up at him. But we don't need a hole in the ceiling anymore. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, newly cut key. It was a copy of his own apartment key. He held it out to me on his open palm. I've been thinking, he said, his voice low and serious, about what this looks like, about what comes next. And I don't have all the answers. I don't know what we call this, or where it's going. He paused, taking a breath. But I know I don't want to go back to knocking on your door. And I don't want you to ever feel like you have to wait for me to knock. I want you to know you can just come over. Anytime. Whether you need something, or you're lonely, or you just want to sit and not talk. I want my place to be your place, too. He gently closed my fingers around the cool metal of the key. I don't know what this looks like, Leo, but I want to find out. With you? I stared at the key in my hand, its sharp edges digging into my palm. It was so much more than a piece of metal. It was a promise. It was an invitation. It was a foundation for the house he'd talked about, the one he was finally ready to build. A wave of emotion so strong it almost buckled my knees washed over me. The years of quiet longing, of hopeless observation, of profound loneliness, it had all led to this. To this man, in this moment, offering me a key to his home, to his life. I couldn't speak. I just looked up at him, my eyes shining with unshed tears, and nodded. He seemed to understand. He leaned down and kissed me, a soft, tender kiss filled with all the words we didn't need to say. Later that evening, we were sitting on my small balcony. We had dragged out 2 chairs, and we were watching the last vestiges of sunlight paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. We weren't talking. We were just sitting in a comfortable, shared silence, our chairs close enough that our shoulders brushed. His hand rested on the armrest between us, and I reached over and laced my fingers through his. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze, his thumb stroking the back of my knuckles. The weight of the new key was heavy and solid in my pocket. I looked at Cole, at his calm profile silhouetted against the twilight sky. The man who had once been a distant star, an object of my secret daydreams, was now here, a warm and solid presence beside me, his hand in mine. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel like an observer. I wasn't watching life from a window. I was in it. The weighted blanket of loneliness had been lifted, not with a sudden, jarring shock, but gently, piece by piece, by the steady hands of the man next to me. The feeling wasn't a terrifying loss of gravity, as I had once feared. It was quiet. It was calm. It felt like I'd come home.